Oh, it's just me. Hi, welcome to Inspiring Philosophy. My name's Than, and I'm the creepy mustache man. And I'm waiting for now Mike to bring everybody else on.
Than, what are you doing? I told you you're in charge today. Introduce us, okay? You got to invite us in. I said you're in charge. Introduce us.
I don't. Okay, I'm gonna invite Mike and from Inspiring Philosophy here, and my friend Tim Howard from Doxastic Mastery here
Thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you for inviting us into the room, Than. I appreciate that. Way to take the lead on this one, buddy. Doing great.
I was not expecting that.
He wasn't.
I'm philosophy inspiring.
Yeah, I thought about it like 15 minutes ago. I was like, you know what I'll do? I'm gonna throw Than in there without him realizing. And you did great. You did so proud of you. So welcome everyone to my channel. But I'm here with Tim, whose favorite color is red, and Than, who is really working on some of his facial hair. I don't know what's happened to the rest, but he's doing a great job. So we're real proud of him there.
I'll try. I'll just grow it faster.
So Than, why don't you tell us, bring everyone up to speed where we're at, what's going on, what are we responding to today?
Yeah, so a few months ago, I debated Matt Dillahunty on the resurrection of Jesus, and a few months later after that, Paulogia responded to the debate with a response video. I was originally just going to make a video responding to him, but the summer's just been really busy with a lot of stuff. And then Mike was like, hey, let's just do a stream responding to this. So that's what this is going to be. I think there was just a lot of philosophical issues in the video that we wanted to address. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to bring Tim with us too. If for anybody that's like familiar with a lot of the work that I've done, if you don't know who Tim is, Tim and I's methodology is extremely similar, and we both say the same thing, just in slightly different ways that helps other people understand the nerdy mathy stuff a little bit better. So, yeah,
I think that's a good point. So my take on this whole thing is that when Paul released his video, I was like, I'll get to it, and I heard you guys chattering about the philosophical issues. I even heard from an atheist saying that, oh no, like there's just a lot of problems here. And as Than and I have talked about on my channel before, we like doing some of these streams because it teaches people how to reason, how to go through these kind of objections, how to respond. And since we're both virtue ethicists, we believe in imitation. So we want people to imitate this kind of stuff, learning through that kind of process. So when I watch this video, I mean, there's just a lot of philosophical errors. And so it'll be very helpful to sort of go through this and see where Paul is making an error, respond, show how he's getting Than's arguments wildly wrong. He's contradicting himself at places, that kind of stuff. Tim, what were your thoughts on the video?
Yeah, kind of just journeying along the same lines. What's really interesting is I was one of the many people who helped Than actually prepare for his actual debate with Dillahunty. I was there in the audience. It was awesome. We had a great time, right? And it was so interesting knowing all the background information that going into it, that when I watched Paulogia's video and his response, I went away incredibly disappointed, saddened, and also confused as to how he garnered some of the criticisms that he had towards Than's opening statement. I think that, especially if you look at the interaction Than and Dillahunty had in the debate, they kind of hit it off, really. Like it was a good vibe. There wasn't this air of ridiculousness around the things that Than was saying. I think that a lot of people went away going that Than was probably the more rational and definitely one of the more cordial debaters that Dillahunty has ever really agreed to debate. So that's what I thought the general opinion was. And then I see Paulogia's video and he somehow got the complete opposite. And I think that a big part of it is, going back to the virtue ethics comments, right? Like one of the things is principle of charity, just when it comes to intellectual conversation, that's a virtue that we should all aspire to, especially. And I just feel like that was completely lost in that video, which then tanked the quality of criticisms. So that's what I'll say on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, go ahead, Than.
I was just going to say one more thing too, for anybody that didn't watch the debate. Like, Matt and I just to echo what Tim said, we got along really well. Like, we still text each other, and we're kind of good friends at this point. So for anybody that just heard, like, here's Matt Dillahunty, and I always see it, like, people leaving comments and being like, oh my gosh, it's Dillahunty, blah blah blah. We actually had a good time, and I got to know him, like, personally, and kind of like him as a person. Like, putting aside the atheist side of it, like, the atheist versus Christian side of things, especially, just like we had barbecue together, and like, he's a cool dude.
I remember that.
So
so all right, so I think just before we get into the video, it was nice to see that Paul said, had some nice things to say about you in the beginning, that he wants to pursue truth. So none of this is personally directed at Paul, as it never is. These are directed at the arguments, as we tend to try to do. Again, if, as I've said before, if you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you. If you bring on people on your channel that are not, then I respond. I take the Jesus approach. Jesus was nice to people when they came in a friendly manner, and then when the Pharisees came after him, he responded appropriately. So, I don't think Paul is being do you think he's being rude at all here, Than?
No, I'll say this: there's a lot of places in the video where I was just really frustrated, and I don't want to. I'm not going to accuse Paul of lying or anything like that. So I'm not going to say that he was, like, purposefully mischaracterizing me or purposefully changing the video to make me look bad or anything like that. But it was a very frustrating video to watch, because if you honestly watch the debate and then honestly watch the video that Paul put out, I think you're going to be like, why did Paul edit it like this?
Yeah,
in a lot of places.
And we'll get into that. You'll see the editing issues and how fans being taken out of context here and there. But let's get to some real quick super chats here. Real quick though, we see Fat Than is in the chat. All right, so welcome, Fat Than. This is Skinny Than version, and I'm Buff IP version. Regular IP is taking a day off. I'm Buff IP, just so you know. That one gamer says, "Here's to a good stream. Love the content, IP. Keep it up. Thank you." Columbo says, "Jesus loves you." Well, thank you, Columbo. He loves you too. And of course, another IP from another version, another universe, Sus Mike Jones. No, that's different from Sus IP. It might be a different version. There's infinite IPs out there for all we know. Yes. Dillahunty is sus, but Paulogia is way more sus. I'm so happy I learned what sus means like 2 years ago, because like I was such an old person. I was like, what are these young children saying with their words like Riz and Suth? In my days, we had proper language to use. Those were the days.
I'm Gen Z.
Yeah, I told you, Mike's more of a boomer than I am.
Oh, 100%. Oh, yeah. Hang out with Mike one day, you'll know that.
Yeah. We used to say we were psyched. Psyched. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, dude. I still say that.
Your last one before we get into it. Your bookshelves are an inspiration to us all. They carry more than a 30-year-old no life in CSGO.
CSGO. It's a video game.
CSGO. Oh, okay. See, I'm old. I'm boomer. I don't know what that is. I practically have a foot in the grave at this point. All right, let me put the video up here, and then we'll play some of this. Again, I think it was nice of Paul to say things like, he complimented you in the beginning, but let's get to some of these issues here. So again, Than, you tell me when to stop. I think you should take lead on this, and then Tim and I will follow you up.
Favors the resurrection. Than's presentation, and indeed his ministry as a whole, from what I can tell, is enamored with Bayesian analysis.
Forget about the gospel for a second. I want to indoctrinate you into the Bayes.
Which I will not be addressing. For those unfamiliar, Bayesian analysis is a quantification and mathematical description of presuppositions and natural decision-making processes.
All right, we can stop
there. Go for it.
We have 2 timestamps. So, Tim, actually, I want you to go first on this.
You want me to go first?
Because, like, I saw the note that you made for the former half of that statement.
Yeah.
The whole, like, is this a dismissal or a compliment kind of thing? What
Yeah, I mean, basically, I just think it's a really interesting way to phrase it. Like, imagine if someone said Than's channel, or Paulogia's channel, is enamored with being rational, or correct logical thinking, or following the rules of right reasoning. Like, I don't know what the point of saying that in that way is, and so I don't know if it's to be taken as a compliment or underhanded dismissal. But I think that a virtue of what you're doing is having a vested interest in good epistemology. That's exactly what we should all be doing. So And Bayesianism is arguably the logic and epistemology of scientific inference, not discovery. People always confuse that. Scientific inference. Discovery is something that can happen in science, not a necessary condition of science. So that's exactly what you're doing. Do you want me to because he had that next part about how he
just
defined
all I wanted to say it
Bayesianism.
really quick too for the audience is notice though, like the one thing I wanted to pick up there was that he said he's not going to be addressing the Bayesian side of things, but almost every single critique he makes deals with Bayesianism in some way, shape, or form, whether or not he knows it, right? The moment that he starts critiquing probabilities and the moment he starts critiquing prior probabilities and talking about prior probabilities, he's talking about this in a Bayesian way, just not whether or not he likes to admit that or not, or understands that he is. So you'll kind of notice that throughout the video.
Yeah, you know, I think you guys said it. I'm going to play the next clip at 3 minutes, unless you wanted to go over these definitions, Tim. If not,
there's the definitions, and Tim, the definition that Paul puts up of what Bayesianism is. I scanned all the academic literature I could find, and I found it nowhere.
Yeah, it was confusing.
So Tim, you got some definitions.
And just to preface before that, this is the way that all of us three agree to do things, which is if you're going to respond to a position, you should try to find the strongest way to articulate that position. If you think that, if you think it's problematic and you're responding to it, or even if you don't, you should try to find the strongest way, the most precise way, concise way to articulate a position. And I have no idea what ball Paulogia was trying to swing at in coming up with that definition, because I have 3 definitions by actual professors and philosophers who have written numerous works and articles, published journal articles, and actually have teaching positions in universities who have published on this. The first one is Michael Tittlebaum. So Michael Tittlebaum wrote a 2-volume work called The Fundamentals of Bayesian Epistemology. So if Paulogia is watching this and he wants to understand the fundamentals, here's Tittlebaum's definition. And tell me if it sounds anything like the presupposition language that Paul was using in his definition. He says, there's no single view that is Bayesian epistemology. Instead, there are a number of Bayesian epistemologies. Every view I would call Bayesian epistemology endorses the first 2 principles. 1, agents have doxastic attitudes. Doxastic is just a Greek word that means relating to belief. So belief attitudes. Agents have doxastic attitudes that can usually be represented by assigning real numbers to claims. So you can assign numerical values to claims. 2, rational requirements on those doxastic attitudes, so those belief attitudes, can be represented by mathematical constraints on real numbers closely related to the probability calculus. Notice that when he uses the word claims, he's more so talking about the abstract notion of like a proposition, an idea or a statement that is capable of being true, capable of being false. Notice how he's not talking about events. That's usually what people try to do. These are just propositions. These are just statements that are capable of being true or false. And then we have Michael Strevin. Michael Strevin is an OG Bayesian epistemologist and philosopher of science. And he writes, there are 3 basic elements to Bayesian. Well, he calls it right here is Bayesian confirmation theory. Confirmation theory is confirmation just refers to evidence. You can use confirmation and evidence interchangeably. So first, it is assumed that the scientist assigns what we call credences or subjective probabilities to different competing hypotheses. Second, the credences are assumed to behave mathematically like probabilities. Third, scientists are assumed to learn from the evidence by what is called the Bayesian conditionalization rule. The conditionalization rule directs you to update your credences in light of new evidence in a qualitatively exact way. And all credences it's just a psychological term for a degree of confidence you have in some idea being true. And then in the beautiful Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on Bayesian epistemology, you have Bayesian epistemologists study norms governing degrees of beliefs, including how one's degrees of belief ought to change in response to varying body of evidence, a varying body of evidence. So those are just the three that we can go through. And here's the interesting part about that. And we can ask the audience, and obviously we know what our answer is, but does that sound anything remotely to what Paulogia was even trying to say?
Right.
I don't even know where he got his.
I don't know where he got the word presupposition or anything like that. And we're going to, as we're going on, you'll kind of see how he's kind of inconsistent with the way he uses hypotheses and presuppositions. So
I remember that. All right, let's play the next section here.
Exists. Oddly, this is the exact opposite approach of resurrection scholar Mike Licona. Mike insists that because history cannot tell us who resurrected Jesus, his persuasive efforts should focus on the event itself and ignore such presuppositions.
Please notice that I did not appeal to God as the cause of the resurrection. I tried to keep this all worldview independent, worldview neutral, and just look at the facts and say, all right, I'm not going to appeal or presuppose God.
But Than admits that my acceptance of a resurrection hinges on the probability that God exists, but proceeds to spend no time on the question of God's existence.
All right. So,
okay, Than. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to have you jump a little bit here because I just want you to see something.
I got it. 1107. I'm going. Yeah.
So just think about what Paul said there. Now jump to the 1107 mark.
In the spirit of modesty, consider a neutral stance on that topic.
After all that preaching to the choir, we'll just concede neutrality.
Then
So
the
we can
prior
just
probability
pause
of
there.
Jesus' resurrection.
Okay.
What did I say in that statement right there? I said for the sake of the debate, we will we'll just, like I said, I think the evidence for God's existence is great, but for the sake of debate, let's just concede a place of neutrality. So Paul probably watched this video all the way through before he edited this. But in the beginning of this video, he's complaining about me not giving evidence for God, when in fact, in my opening statement, I said, hey, let's just concede a point of neutrality for the sake of argument here. Now, I don't know if Paul takes that as me just saying God doesn't exist, but most of the time when you hear concede a point of neutrality within philosophical literature in probability calculus, I'm really just saying I'm going to put the probability of God's existence to a 0.5. I'm going to put it to a wash, and I think the argument can still run. Then 7 minutes later in his video, he plays another, he plays 7 minutes later in the video, he plays this clip of me considering a position in neutrality. So which is it? Am I presupposing God exists, or am I conceding a point of neutrality for the sake of the debate and using conditional statements?
All right, let's play this here.
Cult? Unsurprising. If my minimal witnesses hypothesis is correct, Peter is literally the first Christian from whom all others sprang. So the earliest written account,
we can just stop there
Peter-centric.
He said if.
Right, exactly. So in my opening statement, and this all makes sense because we're going to go back to chronological order. I just wanted to point these places out. I'm using conditional statements like if God exists, and Paul's accusing me of using presuppositions. But later on in his video, if my minimal witnesses hypothesis is true, then is that a presupposition, or is that just Paul using conditional language?
Mm-hmm.
And people, the audience, you guys need to hone in on this. What we're honing in on is there's a blatant inconsistency here. On one side of Paul's mouth, he's accusing Than of, when he uses the if conditionalization statement, if he's presupposing something and being neutral. But then Paul on the other side of his mouth uses the exact same word in the exact same attitude towards the word if to just hypothetically talk about something. So that's the problem, which is why is there this double standard? Why is a completely different standard being applied to Than in the most uncharitable way you possibly can? And then why is he allowed to? What's the relevant scenario happening here that allows Paul to escape the presuppositions and the issue with, but the issue here is it's not even characterized as a hypothetical. It's a presupposition. He thinks that you're presupposing rather than talking about just hypothetically.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Do you want me to go to the 326 clip, or do you want to play this other section?
So the last thing I just wanted to point out at 819, right?
Okay, let me play this first.
Yeah, you can just play it really quick and then I'll...
Yeah.
Remember, Than is arguing for a high
probability that God would want to raise Jesus.
and when God's reasons and motivations are
And we need to stop
unclear
there.
to us.
I'm just,
Okay.
again, pointing out the editing and the mischaracterizations, because if you listen to the debate, Tim, you were there live during the debate. What was I arguing when it comes to the prior probability of the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus?
Not low.
Yeah, the whole entire purpose of the prior probability section is to argue that the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus is not too low for a reasonable amount of evidence to overcome.
Right.
But then notice that word that Paul sneaks in. He sneaks in that I'm arguing that it's high. So this whole section here was just to kind of point out inconsistencies and weird ways that Paul's editing and putting words in my mouth, kind of, which I'll just kind of keep it there.
It's not being charitable. It's taking things out of context is what it really feels like, especially if you paid attention during the debate. So,
yeah.
All right, let's play the next section here.
Cool.
I'm not going to appeal or presuppose God.
But Than admits that my acceptance of a resurrection hinges on the probability that God exists, but proceeds to spend no time on the question of God's existence. For those of us coming in skeptical of God, he's aware that everything else he says is going to be very difficult to accept.
And
Okay.
So, sorry.
Yeah. So all I'll say first is just like this is again why I stated in the debate that I'm taking a position of neutrality for the sake of the debate for whether or not God exists. This is just really basic philosophy. Whether or not it's difficult to accept that God exists or not really doesn't matter for the soundness of the argument. The soundness of the argument and the power of the evidence has no bearing. Like, the value of that stuff is not related to whether or not it's easy for Paul to accept, unless Paul is just the perfect observer and the perfect rational being, right? Tons of people don't get convinced by sound arguments.
Mhm.
Like, if we just flip the script a little bit, every single time Paul makes an argument and Christians aren't convinced by his argument, does that just mean that his arguments suck? Well, no. You would just think like that's the really bad response to Paul's arguments. So Paul needs to state where the reasoning goes wrong, and he just hasn't yet.
And the point is, you were taking a neutral position on the topic of does God exist, which is pretty standard to do in philosophy. I mean, I've seen even atheists take that position to argue for something, because we have to make certain assumptions along the way so that we can then talk about the topic at hand, if that makes sense.
Right. And keep in mind too, this is a debate on the resurrection of Jesus, which means that it's going to be a multifaceted topics: God's existence, miracles, epistemology, reliability of the gospels, all this other stuff, which, like, this is one of the reasons I'm not a fan of resurrection debates. So I feel like Paul could have extended some charity here and been like, okay, well, yeah, this is a debate. Dan doesn't have the time to argue for God's existence and the reliability of the gospels and miracles and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
So,
yeah, one thing I want to say to help the audience out too is there's this really useful thing that Bayesian epistemologists use, probability theorists use. They're called prior probabilities.
Right.
And when Paul keeps saying, oh, well, it hinges on the probability of God's existence. Okay, so that statement alone is such an irrelevant thing to say, because when we say the probability of God's existence, we're not saying that we have evidence in favor of God's existence. A prior probability, the very nature of a prior probability is the probability of some proposition being true prior to any evidence in favor of that proposition's truth. Meaning, we have our background knowledge, so we have information about that's adjacent to the proposition we're talking about, and then that can inform us as to, before we have any evidence for this idea, how probable it might be. For example, I don't need direct evidence against the existence of Santa Claus to have a high degree of confidence that Santa Claus doesn't exist. I can rely on prior probabilities, meaning what we know about human beings and the South Pole, right? And chimneys. all the evidence I have in the background about those things makes it extremely improbable that there would be this being called Santa Claus, right?
Mhm.
And then it's just left up to using evidence to support that. But the issue here is that when Than is conceding neutrality, we're saying, hey, listen, we can say that if it's reasonable to that the proposition that God exists is true, right? Even if we haven't put forth any evidence for it yet, as long as it's what we like to say, complicated word, epistemically possible that God could exist, meaning if it's even possible that our minds could cognitively interact with something that would allow us to have some sort of belief in God, as long as that's possible, then there is some non-zero probability that God exists. Meaning, if it's a probability 0, then it's wholly improbable. It's just a probability. It just doesn't exist that God would exist. So when Paulogia says, "Oh, well, it all hinges on the probability that God exists," what his statement seems to assume is that God's existence prior to evidence is probability 0. But there's this thing called prior probabilities that says, well, it's just most propositions are non-zero. If it's between 0 and 1, it could be 0.0001. I know that Than is arguing that's not that low, but it could be 0.0001, but still not 0. And so, of course, there's a probability that God exists, even if we haven't given evidence for it yet. And a lot of people think that based on the content of the proposition that God exists, that it doesn't violate any laws of logic. It doesn't violate any fields that are adjacent to philosophy that would allow us to evaluate the proposition. So they just assign it a moderate prior probability. It just depends if you can raise it above a decently accepting threshold. So that's all Than is saying. So when Paulogia says, "Oh, well, the probability of God's existence," well, first we have to include this idea about prior probabilities. But it's interesting that he doesn't want to talk about Bayesianism when literally that's a actual central component to it. So I just want to say that real fast.
All right, let's play the next clip here. Keep moving along.
And the probability that God would want to raise Jesus.
First, if I don't think God exists, this is entirely ascribing desires to a fictional character. What's the probability that Thanos would want to eliminate half the population? What's the probability that Peter Pan would resist growing up? And even if you could, first move me to atheistic.
I mean, Mike, okay, Tim and I just want to talk on rants about this. What are you thinking here? Like,
I mean, okay, he's presupposing his conclusion. Like, there's no probability. This is already fictional. Therefore, there's no probability of it possibly happening. So it's circular reasoning. He's just assuming his conclusion. If you basically say, what's the probability of a fictional event? Just like God's existence, because I don't believe in God. You've basically just assumed your conclusion.
Right. Like, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but this is just, again, highlighting how badly Paul's handling the arguments. Like, for somebody that says Than's presentation and indeed its own ministry as a whole, from what I can tell, is enamored with Bayesian analysis, which I'll not be addressing. He's spending a lot of time addressing it right now.
Yeah.
And really poorly. And again, he made a conditional statement in this. If I don't think that God exists, why is it okay for you to use these and not me?
Right.
Like, you don't need to believe in the hypothesis I'm postulating to be able to make these conditional statements. Like, that's basic stuff. Like, do you think, for instance, the people who developed the theory of evolution first believed in evolution and then came up with the probabilities that evolution was true? Or do you think they were like, well, look, if it's the case that some sort of evolutionary model is true, well, retroductively, I might actually expect to see the things that I'm finding. So why is it that, like, this is basic stuff?
Right.
Well, there's a book by Ernan McMullen called "The Inference That Makes Science," and he argues it's a 100-page book, very small pamphlet, and he basically argues that it is called retroductive inference. It's a process of looking back at things that have already occurred, and then using abduction with probabilities, and that he says that's the inference that makes science. Not that science can use it, but it actually makes science. So if Paulogia is someone who's committed to the rationality of science, which I know he is, then I think it'd be in his best interest to be familiar with the inference that makes science, which is exactly what Than is talking about.
And Tim, it's Paulogia, not Paulogia. Get it right.
Okay,
I'll
I
play
don't
the
even
next
know. I hear people say both things. Is that what it is? Paulogia?
Paulogia. He says it all the time.
See, this is the problem. I don't watch
Yeah.
this guy.
All right.
And even if you could first move me to a theistic conceit of a creator being or beings, no other God-based religion through history thought God would want to raise a being from the dead. Hundreds of thousands of years of humanity having entirely different intuitions about what God would or would not do. According to the Gospels, even the disciples didn't think this ahead of time. Everyone who's come to this conclusion has done so post-hoc rationalization, looking
Okay, so-
backwards.
Richard Swinburne,
You see? It's all post-hoc rationalization. You see?
Oh man. So I just want to say this really quick before we go to the next clip because it's going to be related. But like, I just think we have Paul telling on himself here about not knowing some basic stuff when it comes to epistemology and philosophy.
Nice.
Let's tackle the former half of that statement, which and then his accusation that this is all post-hoc rationalization. So he says, no other God-based religion throughout history thought God would want to raise a being from the dead. Hundreds and thousands of years of humanity having entirely different intuitions about what God would or would not do according to the Gospels. Even the disciples didn't think this ahead of time. I saw you scoff about the Gospels side of things too, Mike. So if you want to say something on that before I go off on my rant.
Finish your thought,
Okay.
and then I'll go. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just kind of happily concede that maybe before the outset of Christianity, nobody thought this was true and nobody's intuitions lined up. Here's my question after that. So what? Because even Richard Swinburne writes about the fact that people are going to write this. And I'll just read this. He says, when I give these reasons, the reader, and this is him talking about kind of the argument I gave in my opening statement. When I give these reasons, the reader will be right to feel that I would not have given them if I had not derived them from the Christian tradition. Indeed, I shall be arguing later that neither Jews nor pagans of the 1st century AD expected an incarnation of the sort I shall describe. It needs the Christian tradition to make us aware of the theory. A particular theory of the divine nature and of what a being with that nature might be expected to do, to be found in the New Testament, but articulated more fully by such writers as Athanasius, Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, before we can judge whether or not, by objective standards, the evidence supports that theory well. Most physicists could never have invented the general theory of relativity for themselves, but once it was proposed for discussion, they can assess whether, in fact, the evidence supports it. So long story short, is like in that quote, Swinburne argues that the Christian tradition provides a framework for understanding and evaluating certain theological conceptions, particularly in this instance, the incarnation. And he suggests that the Christian tradition, as articulated by those guys, offers a specific theory of the divine nature and the actions one might expect from that divine nature. And so then he compares that to how physicists will come up with hypotheses and then later on figure out what the probability of the hypothesis is true given the data. In other words, what Paul's complaining about is the same exact thing that happens in science.
Right.
Big deal if our intuitions prior to Jesus didn't line up with this. It feels like Paul's complaining about a lot of stuff that my argument's not actually doing. I'm not just going, hey, my intuitions tell me this about what God would and wouldn't do. I'm saying if we have this conjunction of God's existence and some sort of value theory, the two together tell us what God would or wouldn't do. It's not God's existence and Than's own personal intuitions. Yeah,
the use of intuition was just off. That's not at all what's happening here. That's what bothered me most of all in that. And I think you said it well. So I'm gonna play the next clip.
Here's the basic idea. If
really
God
quick,
exists,
actually.
he's perfect.
Why?
Yeah, what's up?
Sorry, I forgot. On the topic of post-hoc rationalizations too, Mike, I sent you in the private chat the links, but I have a video titled "Do Christians Make Excuses for Their Faith?" And then if you don't like watching videos, I have a blog. I have a written version of this. I'll just put it in the chat for people that want to read it. It's a 20-minute read, but it's basically just outlining why this whole constant complaints from internet atheists about post-hoc rationalizations is really bad, and them just not understanding epistemology and philosophy of science. And they're not necessarily bad. That's all I wanted to say there.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to make sure I got those up for you. All right, let's play the clip here.
Here's the basic idea. If God exists, he's perfect.
Why? Countless cultures have believed in incredibly imperfect gods. Why should I trust Winbird's intuition over theirs?
He's perfect.
It's-
Pursue the best kinds of act.
It's
Why
not
are we talking about intuitions?
it's not an intuition thing. I am putting up a particular model of God. Like when I say the word bat, and I say if bats exist, they have wings. And you were to look at me and be like, why? I know the word bat, and that's what I use to hit a baseball with. I'd be like, what?
Yeah, it's not intuition. He keeps saying that, and that's not what's happening here. Okay, it's about a proposition you put forward.
This is
Tim,
model.
what do you want to say?
And that's the idea right now. My only comment on that is, I mean, sure, other cultures, right? That's interesting from a sociological perspective, but it's evidently irrelevant. 100%. I mean, and that would also negate that humans can like progress in their concepts of things, right? That we can actually have progress when it comes to ideas, and you know, that our consciousness or collectively as human beings, that we can learn things and then pass information down, you know, through certain mechanisms and mediums to other human beings so that they can be on board as well. Like there's also that idea. And you know, philosophers in philosophy, if you're not too familiar, there's this thing called stipulation. And when you stipulate, it's when you take a word and you define it in a very specific way for its utility in making an argument, right? And so at the end of the day, even if there's these quote unquote intuitions, if we're actually talking about the philosophical understanding of intuition and not just this kind of cultural conditioning, I think that's more so what he's talking about, which is not an intuition, that's just cultural conditioning. Then the idea is, well, you have to interact with the logic of the argument. I mean, any philosophy 101 class, they would say that it's the strength of the argument that wins the day. It's not.
Yeah.
And if you need to reform your intuitions in the process, then that's what it is. So.
All right, let's get to some super chats here because they're piling up. When are you going to do a new video on free will? It's not on my schedule right now. I'm going to finish the reliability of the gospel series. I want to do a video arguing the Pentateuch is much older than a lot of people assume in critical scholarship.
Exciting.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna push it. I'm not gonna push it into the Bronze Age. I'm not doing that, but pretty far back. I might. Well, we'll see. I'm trying to.
Undecided.
Well, David Carr convinced me that initially convinced me that some parts of it need to go back to at least the time of Solomon and David, but then I'm finding even more that's making me go, whoa, wait a minute. So I'm sort of collecting it all, and I'm just going to see where I go in the script. That's kind of what I do. Thank you for the $1 super chat, John. But I'm on the video free will. I don't know. I'll get to. There's so many other topics I want to get to. It's just not even on my radar at this point. But yeah, I know I need to redo some stuff on that. So maybe I'll try to fit it in at some point over the next couple of years. Don't remember being asked to be on this live. Well, I don't think you were, Tim. I'm sorry. I don't think we asked you. So appreciate it. Let's see here. IP dropping knowledge bombs. How do you know he's on the right track? Try counting the haters in the chat. Nothing draws hater like the truth. Yeah. You tell him, Ben.
What's up? Yeah.
He will be a Nazarene in oral tradition. That's a possibility, John. I would say it's check out the video I just did on Matthew. It could be just a wordplay kind of thing that Matthew's playing with, because even Bart Ehrman made this argument that the NZR in Hebrew can be branch, and so Matthew's sort of playing with the Greek or the word Nazarene, and possibly Aramaic or Greek, which also would have the same consonants there. So the NZ and R. So it's like, branch will come out of Jesse, and Jesus is also from Nazarene. So prophet said an NZR would come out of Jesse, and look, we have an NZR. It's in Jesus, kind of thing. I think that's what he's basically doing. So check out the video. I talk about it in my video on Matthew that I just uploaded. IP, who's the best church father to read first? Probably Ignatius, because he's early, close. I'd say that. Tim doesn't agree, apparently.
I was going to say Origin.
No, bad, Tim, bad. No.
Trained by Clement of Rome.
You're on timeout. Okay.
Dude,
I'll
It's
yell
very
at him
complicated.
tomorrow when we do our morning call. Don't worry.
He said the first church father to read. Again, Ignatius. Very good letters, pretty
He said
simple. Origin is complicated.
he said best church father, but that's
To
fine.
read first. To read first.
Yeah,
Start
I
with
would go with
Ignatius.
Origin, but hey, this is your stream. I got you.
Disappointed in you, Tim. Disappointed.
I know
You
you are.
see, these kuffar don't even know Santa's from the North Pole. Inshallah. Inshallah.
Shanta.
Oh, did I say South?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh,
How dare you? How dare you say so?
I didn't get my sound effects right.
It happens on streams. I mean,
Gotta go pray.
people will nitpick everything there. All right. So I got the next clip here lined up. We'll get to some super chats in a little bit so you guys can send them in and we will get back to them.
Like a perfect God to me. A perfect God couldn't be harmed in any way by any action of a created being. So
Okay.
none of this atonement would be necessary in the
We'll just
Sijawadi entered the chat. No.
Yeah.
well, right. Actually, that's a really good point, Tim. If why don't you just start there? Like, because Sijawadi wrote a great paper on this topic.
This is just
popularize that?
Yeah, so this is just it's question begging a certain set of metaphysics, right?
Yeah.
About ontology, about what it means to be perfect, about what the nature of the incarnation is like. And so Joshua R. Sijawadi, kind of a complicated last name, but you can find him. He's kind of been exploding in
I'll link
kind of
the
our spaces,
paper in
but he's the
chat.
foremost scholar right now publishing things on the Trinity and specifically the logical nature of the incarnation. But yeah, I mean that's the biggest point, which is like he didn't even articulate what his metaphysics were that would preclude an incarnation from even being possible where Christ's human nature could be harmed, right? And so that's the first part, which is why do I even need to accept that claim without justification?
Well, I mean, like you could just simply respond, like, what if God did want to feel the experience of what it is to be harmed or experience death? How would he go about doing that? Well, a logical way he could do it is go about by becoming human. So, I mean, we're assuming certain things, and I'll see even anti-Trinitarians do this kind of stuff. Like, it's impossible for God to die. And I'm like, what do you mean it's impossible for God to die? Of course he can die. He can take on a physical body and lose the physical body. He can take on a physical body if he wanted to experience harm, experience what it is to have the experiential knowledge of that kind of stuff. So what's the problem?
Maybe God, maybe some sort of virtue ethics is true, and exemplars are great things to have. And so a perfect God would want to be an exemplar for humans.
Yeah.
Like,
so sorry.
No, go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, yeah. So stepping out of the logical realm, because I'm saying like Sijawadi shows that there's no logical incoherence. Stepping into axiology, well, I mean that there's an abundance of reasons about why it would be valuable for a perfect creator of the universe to actually experience what it's like to be his creation. I think that's a very if we are assuming agape love, right, which is self-sacrificial, which is one that only cares about the other for their own sake, right, and doesn't have concern for oneself, which aseity would, if we believe in aseity, that would necessitate that. And God doesn't lack resources or time, then I don't see any problem out of an abundance of love, agape love, that he would willingly experience pain like we would. And so
yeah, the last thing I'll say here too is just, and this is just like a lesson that I think will be really helpful for people in general when it comes to things like the problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness, what God would and wouldn't do, stuff like that. If what Paul's saying is, like, let's just say what Paul's saying is correct, this isn't evidence against God's existence still. This is evidence against the conjunction of God's existence and a particular like ethical theory being true at the same time. So you're really just attacking the conjunction of the two, not just God's existence. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more later probably, but something to think about. It's like not all the time is some sort of argument against God's existence through evil, hiddenness, what God wouldn't do, stuff like that. Not all the time is it evidence against God's existence. Most of the time it's very unclear what this is actually evidence against. And most of the time, once you look into it a little bit more, It's more evidence against particular ethical theories and God's existence at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good way to put that. All right. I'm going to play some more.
In the first place. Alternately, a perfect God capable of forgiveness is capable of forgiveness without any contrition on behalf of the offender. I've forgiven all kinds of people and grievances without being asked. Alternately, a perfect God who is capable of creating a heaven where no one wants to sin is capable of creating an earth where no one wants to sin. Alternately, a perfect God doesn't need to.
Okay.
So all I had for my notes
about Satan.
All I had for my notes on this one was I have a video on this called The Problem of Heaven. Go watch it. The whole God could have created us in heaven thing. I have a video on it. And
yeah, it's easy. I mean, God didn't create a heaven where no one would sin because Satan and his angels sinned and there was a war in heaven. I mean, it's like, dude, you're supposed to be like talking about Christianity and responding to Christians and like this is like your shtick and you don't even know that or you forgot that. And the whole thing about like forgiven stuff I'm like, well, talk about forgiving for what? I mean, like if it's like a slap on the wrist, yeah, that's easy to forgive. But of course, you're absorbing that pain. You're not going to retaliate. I mean, so when you forgive someone, you're basically saying that I'm absorbing the pain. I'm absorbing the punishment, or by not doing anything. That's just how forgiveness works. Now, it's best understood in debt. If you're forgiving someone of like $5, okay, well now your bank account has gone down $5. That's not a big deal. But if you're forgiving someone of like $10,000. You're very well going to suffer for that. And so we would say that in a lot of ways, the crucifixion is the manifestation of God's love and him taking on the penalty of sin in various ways. But I mean, that's a whole nother topic.
Right. So he just kind of threw it in there. I'm not going to throw in a whole entire response to any of that because he didn't really articulate any issues. He just said,
well my thing is capability means absolutely nothing to me. God is capable of creating a basketball only. All right. Like, what does that do for anybody in this conversation? Like, what God is capable of? That reveals nothing about anything. So yeah, there's an extra assumption somewhere in there about capability leads us somewhere.
More than one.
I don't know what that is. That's supposed to lead us to, but I guess it's relevant.
All right, let's play some more.
To punish non-followers for eternity, he can just make them disappear.
Yeah, Than, he can just. Why would God punish people for eternity?
My gosh. Whoa. Okay. So this is. I was real. Okay. I was actually very upset when this first came up. Now I don't know if Paul just forgot about this or what's going on. But I feel like he knows because we've had this conversation before live. For anybody interested in watching, if you go to like Myth Vision's channel, the stream is called Christian Apologetics on Trial. The timestamps are 1 hour and 4 minutes and 50 seconds and 1 minute 34 1 hour 34 minutes and 40 seconds. Those are like the timestamps to go look for the proof of this. And with regards to whether or not God could just make people disappear instead of making them burn on a lake of fire forever, well, Paul knows that I believe in conditional immortality or annihilationism.
Yeah.
The other thing that he'll mention as well is some complaints about whether or not people are going to be who are not culpable for their non-belief in God are going to be sent into this lake of fire and be tortured forever and all this other stuff. And to that point, he also knows that I think people that are truly not culpable epistemically or morally for their non-belief in Jesus or non-fealty in Jesus in this life will be given some sort of post-mortem opportunity.
Yeah.
We've talked about this. So I don't know who he's talking to here. Again, I don't know if he just forgot that about this conversation we've had on a live stream, but it was really frustrating because everybody who follows my work, he follows my work enough to know that I'm a Bayesian, but doesn't follow my work enough to know I'm a conditionalist and stuff like that. I don't know, but he's using things that I don't believe in against me for a video he did responding to me. And that was really frustrating.
Yeah, totally understand.
Freely follow him and who won't. So he can just not create the ones who won't freely choose. And most important of all, a perfect God would absolutely not rest the heaven or hell, bliss or torment, eternal future of beings he claims to love on such a fragile notion as intellectual assent of a proposition of any ambiguity. If knowing...
Okay.
Do you want me to start here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So again, he's just assuming a particular value theory and saying, based off this value theory, I'm assuming this is what God would and wouldn't do. But again, that only disconfirms the conjunction of Paul's value theory he's assuming and God's existence, not theism in my value theory. But also, again, Paul forgets to mention I'm a conditionalist and I believe in postmortem opportunity. So it doesn't hinge on something super dubious, because for some reason, if you just are truly a non-resistant non-believer, I think God's going to give you grace and you'll be given this chance post-mortem to be like, and with all the evidence in front of you.
And that's scriptural. So Acts 17:30, in the past, God overlooked times of ignorance, but now he calls all people to repent. Right. John 9:41, John 15:22, Jesus says of the Pharisees, if I had not come, they would not be guilty. But now that I have come, they have no excuse. Romans 5:13, sin is not counted where there is no law. So if you combine all those verses, you get this idea. Look, there are places where there's ignorance. People are not judged based on limited information. And guess what? Sin is not counted where there is no law. So boom. What's the problem here?
Yeah. So I'm not going to go into a whole entire spiel about my full-fledged response to the problem of divine hiddenness. I'll probably make a video on it at some point, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I only have two things to share, which is, and I want the audience to take this away, because I think that the label of this, what I'm about to say, is easily rememberable. So there's a philosopher. His name is Eugen Nagasawa. He made a book, awesome title, called A Problem of Evil for Atheists. And he defends something called the systemic problem of evil. Where am I going with this? He says that every worldview has its own, quote, problem of evil. It's not just theists. The reason why is because it actually stems from something more fundamental, and he calls it this. He calls it the axiological expectation mismatch problem, or you can call it the value expectation mismatch problem. And he says all a problem of evil is when one's personal theory about what is valuable and then what they would expect the world to look like don't align. That's it.
Yeah.
So that's all we're articulating here is that when there is a mismatch, then you have tension between evil and God, or you have tension between what a perfect God would do or not. All these different things, what a perfect God would do. So he's not really arguing against God. He's just arguing against, hey, these things seem out of alignment. That's all he's really pointing to. So that's one thing that when you guys are hearing people talk, try to find where they are assuming a particular view of value, and then where it's not aligning with their expectations. Second thing I want to say is mere intellectual assent has never been the historic view of Christian belief. If you read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, like just do 2 read-throughs, the kind of belief that Jesus is talking about is one of a full life commitment. You commit it with your being, not just your mind, but your heart, right? And that's why he has his pros against the Pharisees, is he says, yeah, in your mind you think this, but then your actions don't even reflect anything about an internal change. It's the same reason why Jesus says, many will say in the last days, we did miracles in your name, and Jesus turns them away, right? It's not because they didn't believe, right? It's because the belief it wasn't this actual full-fledged life commitment. So Christian belief isn't an intellectual assent. And it's unfortunate that that's the common idea, but historically, Christian belief isn't one of is not equal to sky is blue. You know what I'm saying? It's much
ironically,
more.
Paul even brings this up in his video because he even brings up the fact that the Satan and the demons believed and still are damned. So it's like, clearly that's not what's going on in scripture, but yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's play the next clip here.
Remember, Than is arguing for a high
probability that God would want to raise Jesus.
And when God's reasons and motivations are unclear to us,
and then we ignore the parts of the story that don't make sense because, well, God's got his reasons, or we'll find out later, or God's ways are not our ways.
Which is it then? Do God's motivations align with our intuitions about expectations, or do they not?
So if this is what happened, this would be the most single important event in history. So why is it even subject to debate? Now, one thing that I might say is Matt is making an implicit claim here, and that is that if God exists and this is real, he would want this to be presented in a way that's just provable, not debatable. After all, perhaps, though, God might have good reasons for wanting this to be in the epistemic middle ground, giving us enough evidence to warrant or justify belief, but not such that it forces belief.
Then started by building a case on an appeal to God's clear motivations, but later retreats to acknowledgement that God has unclear motivations, even to Than.
People will often...
Yeah, Than, what were you thinking?
I mean, like, so if you listen to my opening statement, I explicitly stated that the arguments here are for the argument that the prior probability is not too low for the evidence to overcome. Let's start there. Then it plays a clip of me and says, where I say God might have his reasons for keeping an epistemic distance. And I'm timed in that rebuttal phrase. So that's not me just giving some sort of divine hiddenness and some very long, elongated skeptical theism response to divine hiddenness. I'm in a timed rebuttal, so I'm keeping it brief so I can get to the other stuff. Because then he asks if God's reasons are aligned with our intuitions or not, and then plays a clip of Matt saying we ignore the parts of the story that don't make sense. He follows that up later on with a clip of me providing some reasons for why God might keep an epistemic distance from us, and he goes on a tirade about that, which you'll see in a clip. But again, this isn't about intuitions. This is about the conjunction of theism plus the axiology. Our intuitions might play a role in figuring out which particular axiology is true, right? But it's not just all intuition based. I'm never saying something like, hey, God's clearly going to do this based off intuitions, but this over here, I'm not really sure. In fact, every single time Matt says, well, why would God do this and this and this? I'm giving a reason.
You do.
So I just don't know what Paul's complaining about. He's painting me as if I'm inconsistent, but I'm entirely consistent because I'm giving reasons why God would and wouldn't do some things given a particular axiology.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to play the next clip here.
We'll often kind of call these things excuses rather than reasons.
That's excusogenics.
Supports his existence, but not so much that it forces belief. So for instance, I would consider what we're doing here a really valuable thing, right? We're sitting here, and philosophers like to talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? The alethic domains, the moral domains, and the aesthetic domains. Alethic is like truth value, truth finding domains. It seems like the conjunction of God's existence in some sort of value theory would predict something like God wanting a world where we're sitting here and having these really valuable conversations.
I'm sorry. My eternal fate relies on clarity about whether God exists, but so-called perfect God can't give me that clarity because he really thinks it's beautiful when people have conversations. That'll sure be a comfort to Matt and me in hell that the people at this church were able to enjoy a nice conversation. Are you kidding me? Look, ultimately, none of this has any relevance in convincing a skeptic of the resurrection. If it happened, show us that it happened, and I'll absolutely reconcile with these entirely counterintuitive reasons the Bible claims for it. Fine. But Christians, you should definitely drop this line of reasoning with a non-believer. At best, it's saying that if you already think a resurrection is likely, then you're more likely to believe in a resurrection. At worst, you're going to come across as tone deaf and entirely unsympathetic to anyone in your audience who's open to believing in a resurrection, but is so far unconvinced that you honestly believe God is justified in preventing me from making an informed decision about him so that others might enjoy the pleasantries of a nice chat. That comes across as heartless. And
that's not at all what Than said. Like, dude, are you even trying?
Lord.
What?
So, do you notice, like, just a second ago, he's complaining about how I'm like, well, I don't really know why God would and wouldn't do this. And he plays a clip of me saying it, but then he's complaining about me giving a reason why God does it.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to clarify so people understand? And
sure. Like, I gave one of the okay, remember, I'm one of the core, like, theses of my natural theology is that theism predicts value, like valuable states of affairs. As I stated in that video, in the debate, if you conjoin God's existence with some sort of value theory, you're going to expect a certain type of world. one of the certain types of things that I would expect to see if God exists.
One of the things.
Right. Is the epistemic distance, so that way we can have good, like valuable, loving conversations like the ones that Matt and I were having. It's not the only good thing that comes. And again, I'm a conditionalist, and Matt knows this too. I believe in postmortem opportunity. So like this whole tirade, it's first one of all, it's not even a response to
straw man,
to the partial theodicy I gave, right? It's not a response. It's just foot stomping.
This is literally fallacious. That's all we gotta say. Like, this is just literally fallacious.
Yeah, absolutely.
He also said, like, I also said that I apparently I don't know if I understood him correctly, but he, in his rant, he said that what I said is partly like described in the Bible. Apparently I'm going to the Bible for my theodicy when it comes to divine hiddenness, but like I never appealed to the Bible. And then he just kind of rhetorically surmises the whole thing to, if you think a resurrection is likely, then you're more likely to believe in the resurrection. And I'm just like, I don't even see the logical connection between that and this part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, it's just like, no one's saying you're going to be damned for, like, again, ambiguity. No one is saying that God is like sending people to hell so we can enjoy conversations. That is a huge straw man. Like, it can, for the love of God, can we try to represent arguments as charitable as possible? Like, Sam, you were on my channel, what, like 2 weeks ago, and we were doing this again with Satan's Guide to the Bible. I mean, they obviously weren't even trying to be charitable. Here we have another freaking example of that. Like, come on.
Yeah. And then later on, he even says, ultimately, none of this has any relevance to convincing the skeptic of the resurrection. But way before this, he's complaining about how I'm conceding neutrality to God's existence and not giving reasons for God's existence. So clearly, whether or not God exists matters for the resurrection. And divine hiddenness has effects on the probability of God's existence. But now he's saying this doesn't really matter for the resurrection.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of philosophical issues here.
Disconcerting.
So while I find the evidence supportive of God's existence, let's, in the spirit of modesty, consider a neutral stance on that topic.
After all that preaching to the choir, we'll just concede neutrality.
Then the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection wouldn't be so low that it couldn't be reasonably supported by evidence.
I agree. There's no point in even having a conversation with someone whose prior probability is so low that it can't be overcome with evidence. I promise that mine is not. Sufficient evidence would definitely be sufficient to convince me. But I can tell you what kind of evidence, at least on its own, could ever convince me of something supernatural. Testimony.
All right, Than.
So I'm going to share my screen
Whoa.
really quick, and I'm really sorry about this.
You should be.
but
How dare you? How dare you share your screen?
But I promise to keep this math to like
The
minimum.
math.
Okay.
I remember this math.
So basically, all this, okay, so this is a really fancy equation. Paul saying no, basically he's just repeating, it sounds like it. Okay, maybe I'm misinterpreting Paul here, but it sounds like he's just repeating Hume's maxim here, which is that no amount of testimony will ever be enough to overcome the low prior probability of a miracle. Okay, that's Than's modernized rendition of it. Basically, no amount of testimony is good enough. This is a mathematical proof that if you're saying that, the math ain't mathin'. In other words, if Paul is saying, hey, my prior probability for miracles in general is not too low, and then also saying something like no amount of testimony will ever be enough to overcome the low prior, the math isn't working. This is an equation. All it's saying is like, if you have a limit approaching infinity, it's a really trivial equation. If you have a limit approaching infinity and you assume some semblance of independence between different testimonies, that eventually, if you have a non-zero prior probability, and what empiricist, as Tim McGrew would say, how could you be an empiricist and assign a prior probability to any event of zero? If you have a non-zero prior probability and you have any mark of independence, not complete, just a tiny bit of independence between any number of testimonies, eventually the number of testimonies will stack up enough to overcome the low prior.
Yeah.
So this is just a mathematical, like, all I'm trying to say is Paul's math is not math in here. Unless he just wants, because later on in the video, he does say testimony is evidence. So then we have to ask questions like the quality of the testimony. We have to ask questions about the events surrounding, like, the event itself, the distance of the event itself, and stuff like that. I'm not going to go off into a whole rant about epistemology of miracles or anything like that here. A very good lecture, if you want to listen to something like this, is Tim McGrew had a lecture called The Formal Epistemology of Testimony. A little mathy, but he does a really good job of explaining what the math means.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say, like, what about what testament? What if Jesus, does Jesus's testimony to Thomas not testimony enough to convince him that he did rise from the dead? Like, if you were Thomas and Jesus showed up and said, I rose from the dead, is Paul saying that testimony is not enough to even convince him? Like,
right.
You know, if my father died and then I went to the grave and it was empty, my first thought would be grave robbers. And then my mom said, no, he came back to life. I'd be like, Mom, I know you're grieving, but it's okay. And then my brother said it, and they were in their right mind. Like, they were actually, like, they weren't like being frantic. I would probably start to go, okay, maybe something did happen here. And then if my dad appeared to me, okay, he came back from the dead. So obviously, I can't just be like, no, you were faking laying in the grave. I think I could pretty much, from that testimony, I think we have sufficient evidence here. So, all right.
But Paul's not addressing Bayesianism in this video, apparently.
No,
either,
he's not.
But...
No. Thank you for the very generous super chat. Hi, AP, big fan. Just curious if you'd make a response to Prophet of Zod video where he reacts to the absurdity of Christianity. It's called Jesus sacrificing himself. Makes no sense. I think he made some good points. I'd like to see a response to it. Yeah, that was a while ago, and I think it happened around the same time I was responding to Bart Ehrman, and so that just, like, distracted me, and I never got to it. Maybe we get back to it and take a look at it. I mean, if I remember correctly, I didn't remember watching it all. I just remember a lot of appeals to emotion, missing the point, but what I was trying to get at. Maybe Than and I can look at that sometime down the road. I mean, it's answering a metaphysical question, which is, I think, important, and I think it's contingent upon the Christian worldview. So it's like another one of those internal critiques we're debunking. So, you know, you have to assume the Christian worldview. And I think there's a lot of shifty responses in that are kind of missing the point. But I'd have to go back and look. It's been a while since I've looked at it. I just wasn't really impressed, if I remember. Hi, Michael. Love your work. Wanted to say support. Thank you, Harp. Much appreciated. Do you believe in spiritual particles? No. I don't think I need to even posit that right now to believe in spirit. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to the possibility, but I don't think I'd posit it until, you know, I had reason to actually posit it. Yeah.
I'm not even sure what those are, but
yeah. My points are great. Thank you, Than.
Of course, Tim Peterson.
Yeah. How can Leviticus 24:16 be justified? I pulled this up. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him. The sojourn, as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. So I remind people that the Levitical law is not, it's not prescriptive necessarily. It's a lot of ways didactic or exhortational. It's talking about the moral importance of something, not necessarily saying that this is the minimal punishment. So you could compare it to what Constantine actually did. And I was just reading this in Peter J. Lightheart's book, is Constantine did similar things. He'd say, like, you know, if you rape a woman, like, this is the punishment. You're going to be, like, burned or something like that. It's impossible for him to actually enforce that. It was impossible for him to enforce a lot of his laws, like trying to get rid of concubines among the pagan elites. But it was more about expressing the moral importance of certain things. And in that way. So you can make similar comparisons to the way other kings have made these kind of statements. These are expressing moral action without necessarily requiring the minimal punishment. So I might do an updated video on that eventually, because I think the analogy with Constantine and other rulers can help explain that. So maybe I'll do that down the road.
Nice.
Did IP just smile? No, I would never do that. I don't want to harm anyone. How's Elvis, Mr. Alien? What? Thank you, Coffee House. How do you address the Epicurean paradox? My answer is that it makes erroneous assumption of the ontology of free will and being tested. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Was the Epicurean paradox is that like meme, right? Yeah. I mean, I just think on a surface level, you could easily just give a free will defense. But if you want to go a little bit deeper, I mean, just a theodicy is going to take care of it. And
so real quick, I just thought about the Epicurean paradox is like, if God is all loving, then he'll want to stop evil. If he's all powerful, he can stop evil, but there's evil. Therefore, God is either not all loving or all powerful or neither. And I mean, the obvious way to respond to that is various theodicies. Like, check out my video, The Problem of Suffering, a Christian Response. Talk about a law of triumph in there, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, my general response to that is there's built-in assumptions around what each of those properties logically entail, because the whole idea of it being a paradox is that each property entails something that literally contradicts the other property. But I never see anyone put in the work to have that entailment go through without just assuming right out the gate without defense exactly this is what love would demand. And so again, you get that mismatch problem. So that'd be my first response, which is, well, find me a theist who actually has that mismatch problem, and then maybe we can talk. Second thing is, it's super easy. If we understand God is love, and the highest form of love is agape love, and agape love logically requires self-sacrifice, then that logically requires some sort of suffering and pain. So that's kind of how that works. So
I'd say check out my video for more on that.
And mine
did you see the Sam Hakikachu debate? Thoughts? Yeah, Sam and Jay definitely won that. List. I mean, along the way, I think the Muslims had some good pushback, but overall, Sam and Jay definitely dominated that debate. And Daniel's partner was did not help him at all. He was constantly interrupting. Like, he looked like he was constantly in panic mode, and he wouldn't let anyone talk. He was even talking over the moderator at times. And so he made him look frantic. And Sam and Jay had really good responses to things that the Muslims just did not respond to and didn't even try to, which made them look bad. So overall, I think, and the comments are clearly on their side. So yeah, I think they basically dominated that debate. My friend is a fan of Paulogia, and I want to help her see the problems in his reasoning. What should I target, as in fundamentals? She doesn't want to watch videos or study the topics. I'm not sure what to do. Simple answer. Watch these streams. Learn how to respond to his points. That's what we're doing here. We're trying to teach people how to reason through these kinds of things when they come up. So watch these streams we do in response. Start to learn how to do it. Watch some of his videos. Think about that. So watch the streams, then learn some of the reasoning skills, some of the responses we come up with. Then watch some of his videos. Do some of it on your own, because we're trying to teach people how to critically think and how to reason through imitation. Do that kind of stuff. Then get in conversations, and I'm sure you'll do a lot better. So that's the point of doing these kinds of streams. I think it helps people with that kind of stuff. Math, where's Mike Winger when you need him? Is Than a secret wingeling? Are you a secret wingeling, Than?
I don't know what that is. I don't know what they're... Can you help me understand? I don't watch Mike Winger.
If you're a follower of Mike Winger, you're a wingeling.
Does Mike really like math?
Yeah, of course he does.
Well, we got a collab then, I guess.
You heard it here. Than is a wingeling. He's a Canadian wingeling.
Get Matt on Bayes and let's go.
Yeah. Sorry, I made the alien joke. Yeah. No worries, man. All right, let's get back to the video here. We're about an hour and 15 minutes in, so let me know if you want to jump to any places, Than, specifically.
Yeah, I mean, we can just go fast from here on out.
Okay. Well, tell me what you want to play. I'll just keep playing the time markers we have, though.
Okay.
There's a lot of different things we can point to, but the main thing I want to focus on today is testimony. For anyone skeptical of this, consider that there are people that specialize in epistemology, the study of knowledge, and we have a subset of that study called the epistemology of testimony. The philosophers who focus on this are not rejecting testimony as evidence.
I'm not saying I reject all testimony, or that testimony isn't evidence. What I'm saying is that testimony will not and should not be sufficient on its own to establish a miracle. All testimony is potentially deliberately falsified in some way, and also potentially honestly mistaken or misattributing, or even a combination of mistaken and falsified. That someone is lying or someone is mistaken is always going to be more likely, even if a real God is really actively involved in people's day-to-day lives. The divine intervention explanation is always less likely than the mundane explanations.
So if testimony is valuable evidence,
Okay, I got to stop it there. Sorry. Okay, that's just Humean nonsense.
Yes.
I mean, this has been debunked so many times. I mean, no, I mean, like, so, like, just use the Humean critics about the prince who's never seen water freeze because he lives in India. Should he just reject the testimony of countless people saying that if you head north, water does freeze? I mean, like, you could do the same thing with, like, if you're a moon landing skeptic. It's far more likely. I've seen so many people lie. It's far more likely that, given the probability that someone just lied, and I've seen all these film studios, it's far more likely there was an actual film studio than that some people went to the moon for a couple times. So, I mean, like, there's so many ways that can be pushed against. And no one says you just believe on testimony. It's also internal evidence supporting the testimony.
Yes.
So
the
it's,
quality
like,
of the testimony, all that stuff.
No one just says believe Jesus rose from the dead because Peter said so. There are other internal factors like skeptics converting, the evidence of the empty tomb, where it was proclaimed, the willingness to suffer and be persecuted for this, all of the issues with the background knowledge in messianic Jewish expectations. So, I mean, like, there's a lot of issues here. And I just remember people read John Ehrman's book, Hume's Failure. He's an atheist, and he just says, this is just not how reasoning works with so many things.
Yeah. Did you want to hit on the next two timestamps? Otherwise, if you want to speed things up, we can go to 1625.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Just to keep things moving here. I think we've addressed a lot of the points that he brings up there already. So,
who wrote the Gospels in the early church, as you can see on this map? The documents also contain data that would be surprising if they were not written by the people scribed.
Thad's opening statement relies heavily on the word surprising, which is an emotional judgment call. All the men mentioned on this map.
Philosophical blunder, right? Like, when scientists say, hey, this is like, these transitional fossils are really surprising on the condition that, like, humans were just specially created without a process of evolution or anything like that. Are they just making emotional judgment calls? Or, like, if you're like investigating a murder and you see Joe Bob's fingerprints on the knife, but Joe Bob's like, no, I didn't do it. And the detective was like, well, that's kind of surprising that you say that because your fingerprints are on the weapon. Is that an emotional judgment call?
I mean, look, I don't know, can't tell you how many philosophy papers I've read where someone will say, if X is true, it is surprising on my opponent's view that this would be the case. Like, surprising is used a lot in philosophical papers. Tim, you read philosophy. Do they ever use the word surprising?
All the time. All the time. Yeah. You can translate surprise if you don't like that word, right? You can translate it to unexpected, but yeah, I think that his main thing is he thinks that if we say something's unexpected or unsurprising, we are just regurgitating or expressing some personal standpoint, some preferential standpoint that we have about it. And rather than it actually being guided by some evaluative structure that we are trying to be consistent with, right? Just like how the laws of logic, you're trying to not create an argument that, question begs or forms a contradiction, kind of in the same way. We're just speaking that language, but it's interesting. I find it interesting that he used the word that all testimony has the potential for being either someone getting the facts wrong or someone lying, but then he goes straight from potentiality to it's always more probable in these rare event cases that they're going to be lying or mistaken. And I don't know how he jumps from potentiality, because I can agree with potentiality, sure, right? I think you make a good point, Michael, that, well, you also have to embed it within a particular context. Like, what context that the testimonies arise from within lead it to be mistaken or lead it to be deceitful rather than not. That's a conversation you have to have.
Yeah, and I mean, the point of the resurrection argument is that we think it's more likely Jesus rose from the dead than that someone lied. And the reason we do it is just because we don't say, well, given the background knowledge of how many times people have lied versus how many resurrections, it's more likely the resurrection happened. That's not, we're saying there's specific evidence to the resurrection that overpowers that prior probability here, which is important to focus on. And when you come up with a naturalistic hypothesis to try to get around the resurrection hypothesis, you end up actually making something that's very ad hoc and implausible, just in terms of quantity of assumptions. And the only response from the atheists is, well, they appeal to the quality of the resurrection hypothesis. It's a miracle, so therefore it's quality, but quality is subjective. The only thing we can really use is quantity of assumptions to know which is going to be the least ad hoc.
Yeah, one of the things on just that notion too is when you, so I think that's what a lot of people's like basic intuitions when it comes to miracles in general is, well, if you look at the frequency of the people that die and stay dead versus the frequency of the people that die and raised to like come back to life, well, yeah, so the probability, but this is a Bayesian argument, so I like would wholesale reject the frequentist interpretation of probability theory.
Wait, explain. I not because you already know, but for them, what separates how frequentists assign probability and Bayesians? Because that's really important.
So I actually almost got into that in the debate, but Matt did do me a favor there. I just started rambling about really nerdy stuff, and he stopped me during the debate. But the basic idea, right, is like there's different interpretations of probability theory, right? For instance, if I'm a frequentist and I don't have a coin, just pretend this is a coin, right? I'm a frequentist, Tim, and I ask you, what's the probability that if I flip this, that it'll land heads? Like, if you're a frequentist, you're going to tell me, well, there is no probability because you haven't flipped it yet, right? As a Bayesian, you're going to say 50-50 because I have this background knowledge that there's two heads, right? And then we don't actually have like any posterior data yet to work with, but that's the whole point. So that's like, I don't want to go into a whole lecture of this probability.
Well, what it sounds like you're saying is that Bayesians assign probabilities not to how many times something happens,
right,
but to hypotheses.
Correct.
So whatever. It's okay.
All right, let's play the next section.
We're gonna get off on way too long.
Writing in the post-attribution time frame, except Papias, who shouldn't be on this map at all because he doesn't attest to the author of our Gospels at all. See my videos.
Just go to the 17
the men who wrote after.
Oh, you want to move ahead of it? All right.
Yeah.
1706. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'll just be repeating myself at this point.
Yeah.
An alleged tax collector was clearly focused on money.
The people in my life who are most money focused in their passions and conversation are not people who work in finance related fields. Money is important to literally everyone. None of these best-selling finance books were written by people who work with money as their primary occupation. You know what is surprising about the Gospel of Matthew? That the story where Matthew meets Jesus, presumably one of the most important events in Matthew's life, is copied from Mark, someone who wasn't even there, rather than using his own words or using first person. That's surprising.
Okay.
Well, apparently he's okay using the word surprising now.
I was just going to say.
Well, this is insane.
So it's okay for Paul to use surprising, but not for me. It's okay for Paul to make additional probabilities, but not for me.
You're not allowed. That's all we're saying. You're not allowed.
And I would just say, Paul
reads
enough history to know that this is just anachronistic thinking, right? Like, why should we think that the things that we would expect the people to write about today are the things that are going to be reflective of what people then would write about? Where you should be making those judgment calls and assessments based off of the evidence we have of the culture and the context those people were living in at the time. And I mainly just wanted to address the whole synoptic problem thing, because I think a lot of internet atheists love to bring this up. He says something along the lines of like, it's surprising that Matthew would use Mark as a template for his gospel and not use first person language, but we've talked about the first person language thing before.
Yeah.
So here's a response that I just kind of give to this whole like, well, why would Matthew use Mark kind of a thing? And just consider William Lawrence Shirer's book on World War II. He was an eyewitness to the historical events like the Nazi invasions, the signing of the historic 1940 armistice between Germany and France, and he didn't publish his book until 20 years later. And despite witnessing all these events firsthand, his work drew from various sources and lacked any personal anecdotes. he utilized these sources as templates for his own narrative. So that's like a modern example to serve as a parallel for his question about Shire, who had access to modern technology and, by contrast, way less obstacles than people in the ancient world would have when it comes to writing something, with scarce writing and no money and stuff like that. So are we going to just contest that Shire wrote his book because of the same reasons Paul's contesting traditional authorship right now? It's just like, and then he's going to contradict himself a little later on, but that's all I got for that right now.
What I would say is, like, no one says internal evidence alone would be enough to confirm Matthean authorship. We don't. I just said this in my video on Matthew, and I know the atheists are going to take me out of context when they respond to it. I know they're going to do that. I've never said, I don't think you've said, Than, that internal evidence would be enough to prove Matthean authorship. We use it to strengthen the already existing external evidence. So, for example, we have unanimous attestation that this gospel goes back to Matthew. Okay, if we have that, then we can look for internal clues to see if it's going to align with Matthean authorship or push away. And we would argue that the internal evidence strongly supports that. This idea of the monetary aspects that was brought up by scholars like Charles Quarles or Peter J. Williams, it actually aligns with this field of critical organizational studies. And I have this, someone wrote this down for me. So it says, that suggests that people tend to view organizations and their management of them through the lens of their own background. So, for example, a software engineer turned CEO will view most organizational problems as engineering problems. As an accountant will do the same for accounting problems, these kinds of things. So what we're basically saying is that if Matthew was a tax collector, he's going to remember aspects of Jesus's teachings that are going to revolve around money or monetary aspects, tax collectors, debt. That's why he goes there. This is why we see with Luke the medical language aspects, that kind of stuff. So the whole point is not to say that the internal evidence alone proves Matthean authorship. It supports the external evidence. If the external evidence wasn't there, we fully acknowledge this would not work. It's just used to support. And the whole thing about, I mean, just to add to what you were saying about using what Mark wrote about, I mean, like, honestly, if I was going to write a biography of my father, I've used this analogy before, but my mother already wrote one, I would utilize it. If the way she worded something worked for stories about me, I mean, I just use it because that works. Maybe Matthew just read what he saw in Mark and was like, yeah, that basically summarizes it well. Why do I need to change it? Like that's what happened. I mean, so like, why would he change it? So something to keep in mind, like maybe Matthew's just being, easy. And he's like, I'm not going to overcomplicate this. That's what Peter said. He's right. I don't want to contradict him. I mean, and he gets it well.
Yeah. In the 18-minute mark, you can play it if you want to, but we already kind of covered that.
Have we gotten to the part where he talks about the New Testament reliability?
For some reason, I'm missing the timestamp where he tries to critique the onomastic congruence thing. I just wanted to plug what we did there. But
do you want me to go to the 18-minute mark or the 18 or a little bit later on?
Let's just go to the let's start at 1908.
1908, you got it.
These next few points are a little textbooky, but they're important, so bear with me here. The accounts read just like you would expect if they were early, accurate historical accounts based on eyewitness testimony. For example, look at Luke's opening. This is a translation by New Testament scholar Luke Van de Wit.
I have no idea why Fan put up this slide, as even this translation makes it clear that Luke is writing out of the emerged oral tradition rather than any one-on-one interview.
I forgot that he cut me off here. Like, Paul, if you would have just stopped and actually like let the argument roll, you would see why I brought it up. But I don't think he does that. I actually think he just fast forwards past the whole point of me bringing this up. But anyway.
Views. Accounts delivered to us means he's no better informed than the general knowledge of the community.
And as he points out, scholars also compare Luke's approach to historical reportage with that of other ancient historians. Luke's gospel uses language like accomplished among us and refers to eyewitnesses delivering accounts to us, indicating an informed familiarity with the events. And we can also look at how Luke writes just like historians of his time.
Again, historians of his time included supernatural embellishments that no modern historian takes seriously. I'm the one treating the gospel the same as other literature, where Than is looking for special pleading.
Next, scholars widely.
Okay, that is not what special pleading is. that is not what special pleading is. Like, we're not saying that if an ancient text says a miracle, therefore it happened. We're saying you judge each miracle claim based on the evidence you get. We're saying with the resurrection, there is additional evidence beyond just the fact that it's written in an ancient source. Go ahead, Than.
I lost my train of thought, but I mean, like, you're right. It's just, there's so much more that goes into this. And again, principle of charity. Clearly, I know about this kind of thing. So why just assume that I'm just, oh, well, all these other ancient works are clearly fake, but this one's real? No, I have a set of criteria that I use. I have a filter that I use. You'll go through the Lambertini criteria. You go through Tim McGrew's doubt filter, and you ask different questions like, when was this written? How far apart from the alleged miracles in question? Where's the first testimony then when compared to the first, like, actual mention of the event? Like, there's so many different things that you can ask yourself to even ask, like, is this even a plausible candidate to even start looking at? So there's just, I just think Paul could have easily incorporated the principle of charity here, and realized, hey, this is a debate. He's not going to go. He doesn't have time to give everything. But
do you want to go to the onomastic congruence section?
Yeah. Do you know where the timestamp is?
I think it's at like 2140. So I think we can just go around there.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Let's because I want to get to that. So I think it's in here.
No, I'm not.
Another external confirmation of the Gospels comes in their form of knowledge of personal names. This is known in the relevant scholarship as onomastic congruence.
Okay. Well, see this 90-minute video I did with the authors of this peer-reviewed paper on the fundamental flaws and failures of personal name research to form statistically relevant conclusions.
And now I want to reiterate, I'm not saying the New Testament...
Got him. He got you. He got you, Than.
Oh man, it's not like we didn't.
Than, you and I talked about this.
Yeah. So Mike and I worked with Luke Vandewey and Jason Wilson, and they wrote a paper responding to Camille Gregor, and then Mike and I put respectively our own videos out on this on the onomastic congruence.
Now, to be fair, I just want to note the date. This is before that paper came out. So let's be charitable to Paul there. But I mean, you weren't using Baucham's research; you were using Vandewey's, which is not in that paper. So it's we can't get mad at Paul because he doesn't know about the paper you and I knew about at the same time this was going on. But you in the debate used Vandewey's research, not Baucham's.
So I will say, when I was putting together my argument, I was really torn as to whether or not I wanted to use their upcoming paper, in preparation for the debate. But I just decided to pull back on it because the paper wasn't ready. It wasn't in the peer review process yet or anything yet. So, but yeah, exactly. Paul wasn't aware of this paper. But as a response, for him to plug that video as a response to this opening statement, we have a video and there's a paper out there disputing everything that video has put together. And things have been very silent since then. So.
Yeah, I've been talking to Wilson and Vandewey, and we think there will be some response. I don't think they can just let this go, but they're already preparing. Like they're Vandewey is all ready to go. So like they're already preparing possible responses if what they think they could say. So
yeah,
should be interesting. So where do you want to go next?
2045.
2045. So we're going back in time.
Oh yeah, we are, I guess.
So we also have many external confirmations. For example, classical historian Colin Hemer wrote a meticulous book, and in it he presents 84 factual confirmations that bolster the credibility of Acts.
Minor corroboration with general setting is unsurprising, and particularly unrelated to the resurrection, when the examples are from faraway places and faraway times from Jesus' death. From the examples on Than's slide, does familiarity with citizenship procedure, well-known wind patterns, or local superstitions in any way lend credence to his third-hand at best repetition of community beliefs about a miracle? Seriously?
Seriously?
So if you watch the opening statement 2 times, very explicitly when I start talking about the New Testament data. I said, my argument is not the Gospels are reliable, therefore the resurrection happened. This is a maximalist case where I'm giving a two-step argument. I'm arguing for the reliability of the Gospels, because if the Gospels are reliable, then probably the recorded utterances of the eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus are probably what the original eyewitnesses said. And then I make the resurrection argument from there. So Paul's misunderstanding the argument here when I'm saying anything about Colin Hemer's external confirmations here. Those are confirmations of the reliability of the Gospels and Acts. Well, Acts in specific, and with Hemer's confirmations here. So, yes, it'd be very surprising that if the book of Acts was not written by somebody close to the times and places of the narrative, involved within the narrative, going through the travels that the author and Paul went through together, it'd be very surprising that they would get all of these very specific things right. All I'm arguing there is that this shows this is evidence for the reliability, and therefore it has indirect proportionality and influence on the testimony provided for us in the Gospels and Acts, which then provides us evidence for the resurrection.
This is something that I noticed that Paul does a lot, which is he'll just jump to whatever conclusion you're working to establish. But okay, well, how does it relate to the conclusion? Now, I'm not going to let you articulate the steps that would actually lead to the conclusion, but like, how does this relate to the conclusion just directly, like right now?
Yeah,
and that's something I noticed that he does,
statement,
which is really weird because that's not really how an argument works. And that's the weird part to me, because he's saying, okay, yeah, like almost, hey, I'm going to give you these meticulous and very specific facts that would increase the probability of the New Testament's reliability. And he goes, yeah, speed it up, man. How does this even connect to a resurrection? It's like,
in his defense, I'm annoying to listen to.
Especially with that mustache going on. What are you thinking?
Bro, probably boils.
Hey,
no, but I mean, pretty much like that's what he's doing. And honestly, one thing I wanted to say earlier, which is one thing that, again, it's a Hume's problem. Michael, you pointed out great problems with Hume. Another problem with Hume is that he just didn't understand the difference between direct and indirect confirmation when it came to having evidence for something. We can totally agree that these things don't directly confirm that a miracle occurred, but they can actually serve to support some other wider body of facts, and those facts can actually serve to probabilify the miracle we're actually talking about. So it can just do it indirectly. It can actually be it can actually be mediated by some wider set of facts, which themselves support the resurrection. And Hume didn't argue or didn't take that into account because that epistemology didn't exist during his time. And so it's funny that we have that epistemology now. There's actually mathematics around it. It's actually called transitive probabilistic support. That's actually what it's called. And there's rigorous mathematical theorems, proofs actually showing that this is something that can happen when certain conditions are satisfied. And so I find it interesting that we're just, rehashing outdated, outmoded, ways of epistemically arguing for things in an era where probability theory, the probability calculus, didn't even exist. I just find that to be interesting, but that's one thing that you can say, which is, okay, so it doesn't directly relate, it indirectly does, and there's no superiority between indirect or direct. So,
all right, let's play the next section here.
Themselves suffer the same flaw. They are definitionally more likely lying or mistaken than to be accurately recording extraordinary events.
The great metaphysician Bart Ehrman's definition of a miracle.
Yes. Look, I just love when they say that it's before you get into it. I just love when they say it's the least likely thing that could happen is a miracle. Immediately, they've committed circular reasoning, because you've assumed the conclusion you're trying to prove. If it's always if a miracle is always the least probable, doesn't matter how much evidence, because you're just going to say, well, it's the least probable, so something's always going to be more likely. You're assuming your conclusion endlessly. So when you start with that presupposition, of course you're going to come away with a naturalistic hypothesis. You have a presupposition that forces you to take that.
Right. We can go to 2349.
We're right there.
That the New Testament is reliable. That leaves us with two theories that actually can compete. with the resurrection, that either the eyewitnesses were lying or they were mistaken.
Keep in mind that the category of lying includes exaggerations, and that the category of being mistaken includes believing and repeating said exaggerations. It is scholarly consensus that the Gospels represent the writing down of oral traditions about Jesus, passed along person to person for decades, growing and adapting with each telling in an attempt to convince doubters to become converts. It is unsurprising for evangelistic narrative evolution to preserve a few core factual details, even over thousands of repetitions, or for new false points of verisimilitude to be mixed back in, even subconsciously, by ideologically motivated enthusiasts. So again, we are not granting that the Gospels are grounded in testimony, but let's move on with Fan to that fundamental flaw of testimony.
All right, did you want to say anything on that?
So that wasn't the timestamp, but all I'll say there is just he hasn't
said
really. You're good. He
sorry.
hasn't provided an argument against he really hasn't provided any arguments for why.
Well,
what I'm saying is wrong.
What I would say here is that he's assuming an outlook that there's this embellishment, this building up of things, and that's countered by evidence that, like, for example, the fact that we've presented over the years, like, for example, the parables of Jesus, the rhythmic nature of Jesus's words, the fact that Jesus is speaking in a parallelis mambarum, so complicated sentence, that David Unn points out. Like 80% of the synoptic material when Jesus is speaking is presented in this rhythmic nature that would have been easy to retain. Just like kids today can memorize hundreds of songs because they memorize it in this rhythmic nature. The same thing was happening with Jesus' sayings. If they were myth making, they don't have to write things down in this rhythmic nature. A rabbi would do that if he wanted his students to retain his information. Why are myth makers decades later doing this? To try to fool their people? They don't have to. It's written down. So when you have this rhythmic nature, it's not so much what the disciples could memorize, it's how much they could memorize. Because when you're traveling around with a rabbi learning this stuff, it'd be easy to retain that for long periods of time. And we see hints of the oral tradition in Paul's letters, for example, where he is, referring to this aspect of Jesus' teaching and putting into his own words. So there's that to keep in mind.
Right.
All right, let me play the next section.
After Jesus died, he was shortly thereafter buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And as a reminder, we've established the reliability of the New Testament, and the empty tomb is attested multiple times.
Fan claimed that this section of his opening would be an evaluation of whether the Gospels might be lying or mistaken about resurrection, but now asserts the Gospels cannot be lying or mistaken about the empty tomb for some reason. Why can't they be lying or mistaken about an empty tomb? If you have a reason why they can't be lying or mistaken about an empty tomb, just use that reason to say they can't be lying about resurrection, and your job is done. If you insist that the Gospels can't be wrong about one thing, because that would contradict what the Bible said about another thing, you're pretty much in the land of...
So, Tim, you were there live. Did I ever use language like that?
No, not even in the ball. Actually, you specifically spoke in such a way to avoid language like that.
I am using probabilistic reasoning. I never said they can't be lying or mistaken, and therefore I'm not assuming they are. But furthermore, if you just listened to the rest of my opening statement instead of cutting off the clip right there, you would figure out why I'm saying it's not likely that they're lying or mistaken. So I'm really confused there. And it seems like the rest of this video, what happens is Paul just kind of clings on to this idea that, like, well, if there's a chance that they're lying or mistaken, so you're telling me there's a chance, right? So long as
it automatically becomes more probable.
That's the more probable. Like,
yeah.
Where does that jump happen? So,
well, it's just assuming the conclusion. If you assume on the outset a miracle is the least probable, you're never going to get away from naturalism because you're assuming the conclusion. Like, what evidence could you present to override a presupposition that a miracle is going to be the least probable? There's nothing. Because anytime you look at evidence, you're going to go, well, a miracle's got to be the least probable. All right, well, a miracle's got to be the least probable. Like, this is the problem with Bart Ehrman, and when he says that.
Yeah.
Like, and then you even see it in his debates. He's like, he just starts throwing out these random hypotheses to sort of say, well, these are more probable. Why? Like,
It's
based on what?
possible that aliens planted the transitional fossils,
Yeah.
Mike.
Well,
Evolution
yeah, I mean,
debunked. You see?
well, I mean, and ultimately, the only way to be able to posit a near infinite amount of ad hoc hypotheses and still say a miracle is the least probable is if you just assume naturalism is the most probable theory on offer right at the outset. That's the only way you can do that.
Yeah. And what we're trying to say is start from agnosticism.
Right.
Don't make quality assumptions about things. So like, it'd be wrong for me to say the idea, it's just so improbable that Paul would have lied about all this. It's just so improbable because that's just not what I think he would have done. Don't say things like it's so improbable that a miracle could happen. Like, actually look at the evidence and see what's going to be the most likely explanation. Follow the data where it leads. Don't just assume things are based on the quality of assumptions. It's about the quantity to find which is going to be the least ad hoc. And we don't see that. It's constantly appealing to this idea, oh, there's a miracle, so we got to be really, yeah, okay. Tell us, you're basically just telling us in your own words, you're going to assume naturalism no matter what.
Right. Just come on and say it.
Yeah. But then they get mad at us if they'll get mad at like presuppositionalists for assuming Christianity. Like, but it's a double standard, obviously, if they're going to do that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, Odessa, for gifting 5 Inspiring Philosophy memberships. Hopefully those who got them are very happy with that. I think the issue is, to borrow the math analogy, that testimony is the wrong kind of quantity, like asking how many pounds it takes to run a marathon. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. What do you guys think?
Well,
I'm trying to interpret that. Okay, go ahead, Tim.
No, yeah. Well, I mean, there's three kinds of evidence. There's perceptual, there's testimonial, and there's memorial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to treat testimonial evidence as validly and as seriously as the other kinds of evidence. It's just going to depend on a case by case basis how we are using testimony to justify a rare event or any event, right? And that's why I said earlier, which is, well, we don't have to agree that testimony by itself directly supports these things. What we can do is we can situate it and embed it with something else. And this is, I mean, in the 70s, when William Lane Craig was doing his dissertation on the historical resurrection of Jesus, it was known back then that you do that and you situate that within the religio-historical context. It was known even in the 70s as that's something that you do. This is a very well-known thing that you do. So I don't know if that's exactly what this guy's getting at, but that's something I just wanted to say regardless.
For those wondering who's screaming, it's him. This is a very loud cat. He keeps
I didn't hear
screaming.
A thing. There's that cat.
That's good.
There
Freaking like meowing. And I'm like, what are you
Needy.
doing? So luckily the mic is not picking it up. That's good. Do you want to say anything since you keep talking? No. Okay. Never mind. So yeah, also I keep remembering there was a paper. I wish I could find it again. I read it when I was younger about the philosopher pointing out most of what we accept is testimonial evidence. Most people have not. Yeah, most people have not seen transitional fossils.
You did not witness firsthand that your birth parents are your birth parents.
Oh, burn! I mean, but most people haven't. Most people have not seen transitional fossils. We have not seen things like a lot of the experimental results, the Large Hadron Collider. We read articles about it and we go, okay, I bet the journalist is probably accurate.
Yeah, and we do it based on the reliability of the entire procedure. Ooh, almost it's like we're doing the same exact structure when it comes to the New Testament. Whatever, I'm done.
Right. And the response is, well, we could go look at that stuff, but you don't. That's the point. You accept the sufficient amount of evidence from the testimony and you get on with your life. You say you could do that, but for some reason you just don't epistemically. You just take the testimony. So, Shalom. Thoughts on Gary Habermas's new book on the resurrection? If I'm not mistaken, Myth Vision was suggesting he lies or misrepresents the data. I've not read it.
So I'm not a fan of Gary Habermas's minimal facts argument.
Yeah,
but I do think that people saying he's lying or misrepresenting the data are taking some of, I would just call them mistakes that he makes a little too far. Like, I don't think he's intentionally lying or misrepresenting the data. I think, like, there was a citation issue he had for one instance, and I'm just
Dale
like,
Allison. Yeah.
is this really the stink that we're making about this? Like, and I'm saying this as a person that's a maximalist and that disagrees with Gary Habermas's methodology. I think there's lots of valuable stuff to read in there too. So,
yeah, I've not read it yet. I do want to get it eventually. I think like someone was mad about him taking Dale Allison's position.
Yeah.
Because apparently he updated in a newer book. But then Gary Habermas said, and I think in an endnote, I can't interact with it because it's not out when I'm writing this. So
right.
Stuff like that is, but I mean, I think there's some other issues with like the way he represents Bart Ehrman's views, for example, but I've not had time to get to it. I feel I ought to offer some lesson gratuity. Well, you're welcome. Thank you. We're always here to help.
Anytime.
Why do skeptics insist that apologists just go, the Bible is true because the Bible says so, despite the fact that that's certainly not what's going on?
It's easier to attack.
Pretty much. I mean, you can just say, well, you just believe the Bible because the Bible said so. Listen, I do math to solve math equations. Does that mean that's circular reasoning? I mean, scholars use the Bible to prove different hypotheses they have about the Bible. I mean, I got a book right here. Hold on. This so-called, I disagree with so much in this book, but he's using the Bible to prove his theory about how the Bible developed. Is that wrong? But it's only wrong when Christians
for Christianity.
Right. It's only wrong when Christians do it.
Ooh.
Proverbs 30:30 in many translations calls the lion strong among beasts. The National Geographic Doc Wild says it has the highest muscle mass percentage of living mammals. Undesigned coincidence?
National Geographic is wrong, actually.
Oh, you see? Mustache power.
Bro, no way you just did that.
I did it. I did that.
He did that. He's now banned from the channel.
Yep.
What's that?
I would do that.
The lion, which is the mightiest among beasts. Listen, this sounds like an argument a Muslim would make about the Quran when there's stupid scientific miracles, and I would just say, seriously, this sounds exactly like a Muslim argument with the Quran. If this was in the Quran, this would be proof. This would be proof, Tim, that Islam is clearly the truth. And the rest of us goes like, oh, we're doing this.
The rest of us are engaging in Haramates. Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah, I would not use this as an argument for Christianity. I mean, come on, we don't need to do that.
Isn't it kind of the same thing that they do with the decomposition of human bodies when they're like, "What Genesis says is the dust we shall return."
Yeah.
They'll do stuff like they'll trying to remember one of their things like about water not mixing or something in the Quran, like seawater and salt water don't mix. And they do. It just appears as they don't when you see like a river going out into the ocean. It's just some like they'll do stuff like the Quran says he stretched out the heavens and therefore the Big Bang is it tells you the Big Bang because it says he stretched out the heavens. You see, it's ridiculous nonsense. Why does it feel like atheists don't know or lie about what special pleading is, even if the reasoning is bad or wrong? I just think they assume everything has got to be special pleading somehow. Like they don't actually understand the full argument. No one is saying the Bible has a miracle. Plutarch mentions miracles. Therefore, the miracles in the Bible happened, but Plutarch didn't. That's never, ever been the argument. We would say there's insufficient evidence for miracles Plutarch mentions to be verified. There is sufficient evidence because of internal clues for the resurrection. Even Anthony Flew said that the resurrection has more evidence than any other miracle claim. So obviously understood that the value behind the resurrection argument has a lot more evidence for it versus other miracle claims.
Yeah, I just think people don't really want to interact with the arguments, so they'll just play fallacy bingo.
No, I agree. I don't think they have. Again, remember, they think that we believe in the swamp man. Okay, why would they want it anyway?
The swamp man?
I mean, that's the quality of our beliefs. Yeah, so I told Than that I feel like someone like Paulogia's audience views the quality of the rationality of our beliefs as though we are just this weird southern sect of people who believe the swamp man exists.
Yeah, I made this one time. It was a bingo card for atheist arguments. Thought you might enjoy.
Let's go.
Who created God? Jesus didn't. Like, so when an atheist says that, you get to knock a bingo thing off because there's just common arguments we hear all the time.
Yeah.
How do you know it's Yahweh and not Thor or
Thor.
Zeus? You just want
I got
God
hit
to
with that
exist.
the other day.
That's wild.
Yeah,
Somebody recognized me when I was walking in the street, like downtown one day, and they're like, "Hey, you're exploring reality." I was like, "Yeah," and they're like, "Wait, I got a question for you." There's literally like that's how the conversation went, and then they asked me about Thor.
But my favorite one, I don't care. Your evidence just isn't convincing. I'm like, yes, like that's what isn't that kind of what we got today?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I forgot about my bingo card. You mentioned bingo card, so it brought me up. What is it saying?
We're like 2 hours in almost, so we can fast forward to a lot of stuff. Do you want to go?
What part do you want to play?
Do you want to start at like 27:10? Skip a few things and
yeah, we'll go to that 27:10, and then we'll wrap up here soon. Get to some more super chats. So, if anyone in the audience wants some more super chats, send them in now, and we will get to them after in a little bit here.
The post-mortem appearances of Jesus. People claimed to have experienced encounters with him after his death.
Objection, assuming facts not in evidence.
Sustain.
None of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus in the Gospels are first-hand accounts.
The witnesses are not uniform groups.
so okay. It's almost like the last like 15-20 minutes of my opening statement didn't happen. He just doesn't believe. He just doesn't agree with the arguments. So that way, it's question begging. Apparently. Second of all, I explicitly stated in my opening statement that not all of these are first-hand accounts. I explicitly stated some are first-hand, some are second, some are third, and that's totally fine. And if somebody wants to be like, well, first-hand, second-hand testimony or hearsay is not admissible in court, you can look up the federal rules of evidence and what's admissible, and you will find that hearsay is admissible in court under certain conditions. And those conditions, when you look at the federal rules of evidence, are actually lined up with the types of testimony that, at least I think, we find in the Gospels if you have gospel reliability and everything. So,
yeah.
So, we
Groups
can
of
go. Yeah, you want to just fast forward a little bit more to like the list of evidence, 3051.
3051, you got it. And I remind people, we don't argue the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from internal evidence. I want to make that very clear. It's the external evidence which has unanimous support, and then internal evidence supports that. So, all right, 3051, you said?
Yeah.
Let's take a look at the list of evidence about gospel reliability that Fan thinks is best explained by a man rising from the dead. 100
so
years
right there,
after being
just-
written, the Church agreed.
I wanted to point that out.
What?
Did you hear the way he phrased that? Like, did you hear any
Yeah.
issues? Okay, well, what's the issue there?
You didn't say from gospel reliability, therefore Jesus rose from the dead.
I explicitly stated twice in my opening statement that that's not my argument.
Yeah. The straw manning. Utter straw manning.
I just, it's a two-stage argument. One for reliability, from reliability to the probability of the original eyewitnesses. This is what they said. And from there to the resurrection. Tim already talked about how you can have indirect confirmation. Like, I just, what's happening?
Well, I mean, like, can we stop straw manning the position? Again, we saw this 2 weeks ago with the Satan's Guide to the Bible response. Fan, you were there.
Yeah.
It's the same stuff. Just, you're not trying to represent our position fairly. You're not steel manning it so you can knock it down. You're straw manning it so you can get some nice laughs and giggles from your audience and feel like you did something here.
Yeah.
And it's just very easy to say, we have to keep
No
coming back
evidence.
going, that's not what was said. That's not what was said. Can you represent our arguments fairly? Or are you afraid your audience, if you hear the arguments represented fairly, they're going to start to question what you're arguing? Can we just try to be charitable?
Right.
Yep.
If Tim, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No.
Okay. The next thing we can do is the 3142 mark, and then we just have two more after that.
3142.
This is exactly what we'd expect to see if Jesus had risen from the dead. But now ask yourself this. How likely would it be to see these things if Jesus was dead?
Are these facts equally, or better, explained by viewing the Gospels as evangelical tools that merely codify decades of oral tradition about Jesus? Yes,
Now,
people can
notice-
mistakenly agree.
Part of my Bayesian argument, right, was to give you a contrastive expectation, meaning I outlined what you would expect to see if Jesus did rise from the dead, which was the types and quality of testimony that we had. And then Paul cut me off, but I gave examples of what you would expect to see if a failed Messiah that didn't rise from the dead died and stayed dead. But Paul didn't show that part where we had like people like Simon Bar Kokhba who died and stayed dead and his movement died out. You just cut me off. Again, it's really frustrating because he's not actually showing his audience the arguments that I put up, and he's just kind of cutting me off, straw manning me.
This is a huge straw man. Huge.
And notice the double standard again. When it comes to the resurrection, we need it to necessarily be the case that it happened. No possibility of other hypotheses. No silly probability talk. But when we get to any other competing theory, like his minimal witness hypothesis, so long as the possibility is there, who cares about the probability? We have trumped the Christians and we can go on our merry way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. What's the final section you want to play?
33. Okay. So in like the 33:19 mark, he just says that he attacks the data. He doesn't. So we can just kind of skip that. And then 33:24 is the last one.
33:24.
Attack the explanation of the data by giving a better one.
I've also done this. The Gospels as codification of decades of evolving oral tradition is not only scholarly backed, but by Occam's razor, it has fewer assumptions because I don't need to posit anything supernatural.
So if these things are not met by the end of the debate, we can reasonably conclude.
I just wanted to hit on that. Notice that there's just an assumption that goes into that the fact that God exists and that he would want to raise Jesus from the dead. That's a really complicated hypothesis, apparently, and it's much simpler to posit numerous auxiliary hypotheses to save yourself from the resurrection hypothesis. You said it earlier, right, Mike? You said it's the quality. It's not just the quality of the hypothesis; it's the number of the hypotheses that matters. So for Paul, well, he just doesn't think that God exists. So obviously that's a very complicated hypothesis and a very burdensome hypothesis. But it's like, if you follow the argument and you put a 0.5, which I did, that changes things up a little bit. Not to mention, I have a video on the simplicity of theism, on like the simplicity of theism as a hypothesis and all that stuff. But I just think that this is just kind of one of those internet atheist rhetorical things that they say all the time, but they don't really explain why positing a supernatural hypothesis like a miracle happened is so complicated that it just gets trumped by everything else.
Yeah. And again, it's not like you said gospel reliability, therefore Jesus rose from the dead.
Exactly.
The fact that he has set your argument up like that with his check marks and boxes is I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but it really appears to be a straw man.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, when he says like it'd be like more likely that the gospels evolve theologically, I mean, we push back on that with the evidence we use, going, why would they evolve in this fashion? A lot of the data and for gospel reliability suggests this is early stuff that would not have evolved, like the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, to give one example. There's no reason to think this evolution would happen in such a short span of time, given certain factors that I talk about in my reliability of the gospel series or other things. So it's assuming certain things that have already been challenged in various ways.
Right. So that was the last time.
Go ahead, Tim.
No, I just wanted to say that it's really weird because, I mean, why are we assuming just like categories of stuff, and then because something's a particular category of a thing, therefore it's going to be, that's how we like do our probability assignments. Like why does it have to be supernatural? Because he says the word he biases the word supernatural there. Why can't just we call things stuff, right? Like why does there have to be these categories that we divide things into and then go, well, if it's in this category, then has a completely different set of rules than the one in this category. What if I'm just somebody who believes that everything is just of the category stuff? What if I think there's just that things exist? What if I just say events happen, right?
Mhm.
Then where does that put me? I want to know what Paul would say. Like, if I just believe that, does it make one thing more probable than the other because everything is just one thing? You know what I'm saying? It's weird because we don't have to take that assumption on that supernatural. Therefore, what if I don't even agree with that? What if I just think that things?
Yeah, I disagree with the distinction.
Yeah. That's another point we've hit on. We don't even agree with the natural supernatural distinction. Like or abstract objects supernatural. I mean, like, are thoughts supernatural? So quantum entanglement, you can have two particles separated by, great distance, change the one affects the other. That would move. That's not moving through space because it's moving faster than the speed of light. Is that supernatural? This distinction is just crap, and it's never been properly defined. And if you read philosophical literature on it, it's a modern concept that just doesn't translate well, especially to ancient texts, let alone just text today.
Yeah, real fast. I love Josh Rasmussen was one time having a conversation with Graham Oppie. He said, okay, Graham, he said, if I was transported to the beginning of the universe the way that I am, would I be supernatural? I love that question because the whole idea is, well, minds come later. He's like, okay, but what if everything that I am, if I'm natural, if I'm at the beginning of the universe, am I now supernatural? I just thought it was a funny question.
Yeah.
It's I use the quantum entanglement example because how do we explain that? I mean, they'll just say, well, we have that's evolving definition of natural, and I'm like, okay. I mean, well, then we're just, again, getting back to the assumptions. We're just assuming the conclusion it's always natural regardless, but we're not properly defining what supernatural is. And so, all right. Hey, IP, did you see the Christian versus Islam debate? I saw it. And I mentioned earlier, and this was another super chat. I'm pretty sure the Christians did far better. It just, a lot of issues. Again, Daniel's partner did not do well. He came across nervous. Then Daniel tried to make personal attacks against Sam at one point, which just made him look like he was low blows because he was attacking Muhammad. I'm like, well, you guys are attacking each other's religion. So just didn't look good for the Muslims. Looking for feedback. I'm looking to become an Old Testament scholar with a focus on apologetics, philosophy with language. Any advice? I think that's great. Find an area to go into, get your PhD, find an area you think would be good to discuss on. Focus on apologetics, philosophy. Depends on what you mean by that. So I would want to know more information about what you're trying to say there. Depends. I mean, if you want to get an apologetics degree, Biola offers them, for example. If you want to be an Old Testament scholar, though, you got to actually go into studying Hebrew Bible, not apologetics. You got to go into Hebrew Bible. So that's what I would say on that.
There's alternative methods, yeah.
Thank you for the super chat. Really love the debate. Than did a great job. Sad to see people misrepresent his arguments like this, though. Yeah. I mean, am I being rude by saying straw man Than, or do you think that sometimes he did straw man you?
Oh yeah, it's whether or not it's intentional. I'm not sure, right?
I would agree with that. Yeah. I don't think
it's whether or not it's intentional. It's still a straw man.
Yeah, for sure. Atheists don't need philosophy lessons. Atheists have too many lessons and have been spoiled as per Colossians 2:8. When they're in synagogue, that's the word Paul uses there, in synagogue or something. I don't understand Paul's point here. It's like he gets close to Than's argument, and then before he takes a random swerve to the left and goes off on the rails.
Yeah, pretty much.
It seems like that's what's happening here. A lot of the times the arguments are about the Gospels being from the first century eyewitnesses. What about Peter, James, Jude, John, these guys? They're again, different arguments. Testify. Eric Manning was supposed to be here today. He couldn't make it at the last minute. But he's presented arguments for Paul's epistles, for example. Similar arguments would be made for these as well. You can make the case that a lot of these are early. There's just some of the letters are so small and short they wouldn't be quoted by church fathers, which is why you're not going to see them there. But again, there's different arguments for those as well. Any plans to update the Resurrection series? Yes, for sure. I don't know when I'll get to it though, but yeah, there's definitely plans for that. It would be several videos though. Like I'm doing a gospel reliability series now, and that's going to be like 15 some videos. And that one will probably be even longer. I'm just trying to figure out how to structure it though. What is a quick sum up of the case for Christianity?
Watch
What do
my
you have to
opening
say?
statement.
I mean, the quick summarize, you argue for the reliability of the Gospels. If they're reliable, they go back to the men who claimed that they wrote, that the church says wrote them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have good reason to believe that we have eyewitness testimony from like Peter through Mark, Luke through the people he met in Jerusalem, then Matthew, and of course John. And my video on John will be out in October, by the way. And so with that, it's good reasons to think certain facts happen. They did see Jesus physically walking around, or at least they thought that was the case. They did find an empty tomb. They were willing to face persecution for this, as the book of Acts documents, and as Paul's letters do as well. So we have that. What's going to become more likely? We have evidence, skeptics converted like Paul and James, for example. And so then we start to build a case on that, what naturalistic explanation can explain all these facts in a simpler way than the resurrection can. And of course, again, it's not about quality, because quality is subjective. It's about the quantity of assumptions one has to put in, and runs into problems along the way when they try to do that. Thank you for becoming a member, Matteo. Much appreciated with that. All right. We've been going a little bit over 2 hours. Any final thoughts from you two?
Nothing on my end. Yeah. Thanks for having me on for this. I've been wanting to respond for a while, and this was probably the best way to get it done during this busy summer for me.
Yep. More live streams coming. I got more stuff to respond to. And if Paul wants to keep doing responses to me because he's been on a rampage lately, we'll be here. These are not hard to plan for and do.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I got friends. I got friends like Than, and I got friends in low places like Tim. Look at him. He's on the bottom part of the screen.
On my way up in due time.
The thing is, Tim's in low places because he doesn't do many videos. He does something.
I can bump him up. Ready? Here we go.
There you are.
Look at that.
Right. Look at that.
Got
Beautiful
him.
butterfly. No, the only thing that I'll have to say is thanks for having me on, and this has been really, really fun. So I went through a whole new rebrand, which is awesome. Anybody that on here knows me as previously as invoking theism. My entire mission and initiative is now doxastic mastery, which just means belief mastery. And the entire purpose of that is to push people from apologetics to developing their worldview, because apologetics is just a natural outflowing of when you're aware of all the reasons you have for all the beliefs that you hold, because a worldview is everything that you believe. So what I do is I specialize in training people on the tools how to do that. So if you subscribe to my channel, you'll see me post more on that, and subscribe to my social media. I'm very active on there. If you keep up with the journey, then hopefully you will be able to get benefit from the value that I'm putting out. And then hopefully we can talk, because I do mentoring and I help people go from 0 to 60 in the quickest way possible. So you're not spending thousands of hours watching YouTube videos and books and not knowing if they're good or not. So that's it.
Besides Mike and I's videos, those ones are good.
I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Mike and y'all. So I agree with that.
Yeah. So yeah, just keep in mind that you kind of do stuff a little bit more personal stuff than like what they do at like Talk About Doubts. Is that right, Tim?
So what I do is I do more of a long-term, very intimate approach when it comes to two areas of natural theology and the problem of evil. So instead of what I do is I go through session periods with people. And right now I'm actually launching, I'm in the pre-launch phase of our online school right now. It's called the Paradigm Process. It's a worldview academy. Paradigm is we all go through when we change our beliefs, we go through paradigm shifts. And so what I'm doing is I'm doing a group-based platform of how do you actually traverse going from unconfident to confident when it comes to these beliefs. And so I work with people on an ongoing long-term basis. And so if you want to basically, if you've had thoughts about, hey, should I go into college or university, or should I attend a workshop and whatnot? This is kind of the middle ground on how to do that. And I create roadmaps for people on exactly what to read and how to get there. And so it's a more broad, it's a broader scope and a broader vision. It's going to leave you with permanent tools and processes on how to navigate these things. So if you want more of a kind of attendee school, ongoing workshop, have access to me, ask me your questions on a more long-term basis, then that's what it is for you. That's how I would describe that.
All right. Well, appreciate you guys coming. You can check out Tim's work on his channels. Stand on his, they're linked below. I'll be back next week. I'm going to be interviewing a scholar in his book on how Christianity was crucial for the rise of modern science. You're not going to want to miss that. We're going to be debunking a lot of really dumb arguments that new atheists use to try to attack this concept. And we'll be going through a lot of research showing that Christianity was crucial for the development of science. So I'll be back, I think, next Thursday. So I'll announce that this weekend, and I'll see you